Hey guys, alright? Welcome everyone. We start by seeing a car on a road in British territory. In the back seat, there's an American woman sleeping, Greta Evans. She is awakened by the driver when they finally arrive at the house where she will work. The driver informs her that the homeowners needed to step out for a moment and that she should wait for them in the parlor. Greta enters the house and takes off her shoes, leaving them next to her belongings at the entrance. When she hears a noise coming from upstairs, she decides to go up there. On the way, she encounters a painting, an image of a couple with their child, presumably the family she will work for. She goes further in and finds the child's room, where she enters and picks up a toy to take a closer look. The toy drops to the floor when she is startled by a man named Malcolm, arriving from behind her. He is the delivery man for groceries. After introducing himself, he asks her to follow him to the kitchen to show her around, which she accepts. Upon arriving there, they start putting away groceries while chatting. Malcolm assumes she's American and running away from someone. Anxious to change the subject, Greta asks about the family. Malcolm says they are very kind and generous. When she asks about the child, he hesitates to say something and mentions he doesn't know how to explain it. They are suddenly interrupted by Mrs. Heelshire. Mrs. Heelshire enters and asks why Greta isn't wearing shoes. Because of this, they return to the entrance of the house to fetch them, but the shoes are not there. Mrs. Heelshire says they will show up soon as it was just her son playing around. In another room, Mr. Heelshire is conversing with his son, Brahms, whose face is hidden behind the chair. The two women then arrive, and Mrs. Heelshire introduces Greta to her husband and son, but as they step back, the figure seated in the chair reveals to be a doll. Greta laughs, thinking they're playing a prank on her, but their serious expressions indicate otherwise. They are interrupted by Malcolm, who enters the room and interacts with the doll as if it were a real person. Malcolm then exits, and encouraged by his reaction, Greta approaches the doll, shakes its hand, and says she hopes they can be friends. Mrs. Heelshire asks her husband to take Greta's belongings to her room while she shows the new nanny everything she needs to know. As they climb the stairs, Mrs. Heelshire tells Greta they've tried other nannies before, but Brahms rejected them, although they weren't as young and pretty as Greta. Upon reaching Brahms's room, Mrs. Heelshire instructs Greta on the daily routine. Brahms is to be awakened every morning at 7 o'clock and changed into clean clothes, which Mrs. Heelshire asks Greta to demonstrate. She disapproves of how Greta does it, so she takes over and does it herself, and then they head to the study room. Brahms has 3 hours of lessons 5 days a week and enjoys starting with poetry. Next is musical appreciation, which is very important to Brahms and must be played loudly. A few hours later, they all dine together, including the doll. When they finish, Greta takes the leftovers to the kitchen, but Mrs. Heelshire says they don't throw food away because they're in the countryside. They should store it in the freezer for emergencies. Mr. Heelshire then enters, hands Brahms to his wife, and takes Greta with him to check the traps. Greta follows him outside and finds him retrieving rats from the traps in the garden. While they do the check, Mr. Heelshire tells more about the house, like how all the windows have been permanently shut. Mr. Heelshire says he's not sure how they got to this point, but tells Greta that no matter how it may seem from the outside, their son is there with them. Greta says she understands. At night, the parents tuck Brahms into bed, and they all pray together while Greta listens. They include her name in the prayer. Mrs. Heelshire asks Greta for a moment of privacy with her family. Greta waits outside while they talk, but the couple is quick to come out a moment later to tell Greta that Brahms wants her as his nanny, if she accepts him. Greta agrees, and Mrs. Heelshire hugs her. Greta goes to her room to call her sister Sandy on the landline phone. She tells her how everything is strange, including the lack of Wi-Fi and phone signal. Sandy says Greta needed to get away, and this job fits perfectly into her situation, then confesses that Greta's ex, Cole, has been calling the house non-stop, even showed up at the house and scared her son. But she hasn't told him anything about Greta's current location and promises she never will, not wanting to see her sister hurt again. The next morning, Greta leaves her room upon hearing some noises and finds Mrs. Heelshire scolding Brahms for throwing his toys on the floor. Mr. Heelshire startles Greta as she watches, apologizing for the sudden rush. He tells her it's been so long since they've been on vacation, so they're looking forward to traveling. He also gives Greta a sheet of paper with the rules she must follow every day. We follow Mr. Heelshire and Greta as they walk towards the entrance of the house. When Mrs. Heelshire joins them with Brahms in her arms, Mr. Heelshire tells Greta to be good to their son because then he'll be good to her in return. However, when he mentions that if she isn't good, his wife interrupts him. Greta promises to treat him as if he were her own son, and after receiving the doll, Mrs. Heelshire hugs her and apologizes in her ear, leaving Greta confused and not understanding Mrs. Heelshire's behavior. Greta takes Brahms outside, and together they watch the couple leave by car. Once inside the house, Greta doesn't follow the rules. She leaves Brahms on a random chair and covers him with a blanket because he startles her before going to the kitchen to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that she takes to a reading chair, where she drinks some wine and eats while reading a magazine. Eventually, she falls asleep. It's night when she wakes up. She picks up the tray and intends to take it to the kitchen but stops halfway when she realizes the blanket has fallen off Brahms. Startled by this, she picks it up and takes him to his room, tossing him carelessly on a rocking chair before going to bed. Greta is awakened by the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the house. She leaves the room to investigate and, when she reaches the family painting, approaches to look at the child and is suddenly grabbed by the neck by a hand coming out of it. This is the exact moment she wakes up in bed, perfectly fine. Upset by this dream, she dresses and goes to Brahms's room to check on him. He's in the chair where she left him, and there's water dripping from his eye. Greta approaches, nervous at the idea that they might be tears, but she quickly finds out that it's just water from a leak in the ceiling. To protect the doll, she moves him to the bed before leaving. In another part of the house, she finds a door to an attic and tries to open it using an iron poker, but to no avail. Later that day, we see Greta trying to keep busy. She tries to call her sister, but only gets the answering machine. The phone rings as soon as she hangs up, and Greta quickly answers, but only hears static noise. The next day, Greta is at the gates picking up the mail when Malcolm arrives in his car with groceries. They go to the kitchen, where Malcolm shows her that they must throw away all the leftover food in a garbage bag that he will take with him. Greta complains that Malcolm didn't warn her about Brahms, and he says he didn't want to spoil the surprise. Greta asks him about the story behind the doll. Malcolm takes her to a grave near the house. It turns out that Brahms didn't survive a fire in the house on his 8th birthday, and the doll appeared the next day. Malcolm says he knows it all seems very strange, but it's harmless. Greta does the math and realizes that the couple has been living like this for 20 years. Malcolm tells her they were looking for a nanny for a year before Greta showed up, and if she's feeling restless, he can take her out and show her the nightlife in town, promising not to tell anyone. Greta accepts after making sure Malcolm understands it's not a date because she just got out of a relationship. In Brahms's room, we find out that all conversations in the house reach Brahms through the walls. Greta is in her own room on the phone with Sandy, telling her about her plans for the night, but she can't convince her sister that this isn't a date. Sandy approves, saying her sister Greta needs to get out more. Looking in the mirror, Greta notices Brahms looking at her from the other room. Feeling scared again, she closes the door. Moments later, she goes to the bathroom to take a shower, unaware of another presence in the room that takes her dress and necklace. When she comes out and looks at herself in the mirror, she realizes a piece of hair is missing, and shortly after notices the missing items as well. Upon returning to her room, she finds all the drawers open and all her clothes also missing. Scared, she leaves the room, only to find the attic door open and the stairs ready to go up. Beginning to think there might be an intruder, she grabs the iron poker and enters the attic. Once she's inside, the door closes behind her, and she can't open it again. When she hears a car, she goes to the window to see Malcolm knocking on the door. She tries to make noise to get his attention, but he can't hear her. She then tries to break the window with the poker, but only manages to break the poker itself, and Malcolm leaves. While trying to find a way out, a human shadow startles Greta and she falls to the ground, and the blow to her head causes her to faint. She wakes up the next morning still in the attic. She discovers that the shadow she saw the night before was just some clothes on a hanger and finds a photo album of Brahms' childhood. Among all the photos, there's one of the painting in the photo it was based on, although in the original, Brahms looks much more serious. Greta is startled out of her thoughts by the attic door suddenly opening by itself. Greta exits and goes to her room, only to find her clothes back hanging all over the furniture. Malcolm shows up a few hours later to help her check the house for intruders, but he finds no signs of a break-in. Greta points out that this doesn't explain her clothes. To help her feel at ease, Malcolm decides to stay close by. While playing pool, Greta asks Malcolm to tell her more about the real Brahms. He says he doesn't know anything else, but he's clearly lying, so Greta insists. Malcolm tells her that there are two kinds of stories in town and the truth lies somewhere in between. The polite conversation says Brahms was a good boy, the bar conversation says he was very strange. When Greta asks for the truth, Malcolm tells her about the day he went to the house with a delivery for what would be Brahms' birthday. Mrs. Heelshire was opening presents with the doll while Mr. Heelshire was in the billiard room, drinking and muttering that he couldn't do it anymore. He invited Malcolm to drink with him, and Malcolm also asked him about the real Brahms. The father replied, with a desolate look, that the boy was strange. After making sure Greta is really okay on her own, Malcolm leaves. Greta then goes to her room to talk to her sister on the phone. Sandy informs Greta that Cole has been to her house again. Sandy's son, trying to get rid of him, gave Cole Greta's address. Sandy apologizes, but Greta doesn't blame her for it. After hanging up, Greta goes to the bathroom to brush her teeth and notices a moving shadow in the mirror. She goes to Brahms' room, where she finds a bunch of papers on the floor. She adjusts the position of the doll's face, but it moves on its own to look at her, and at that moment, once again, Greta wakes up in her bed. She hears some noises outside, so she goes to her door and opens it, only to find her lost shoes waiting for her. Scared, she goes to Brahms' room to find him in a new position, sitting on the edge of the bed, with the list of rules next to him. Greta runs back to her room and locks the door, then tries to make a call, but the phone isn't working. She hangs up, and the phone rings immediately after. When she answers, a child's voice says her name and asks why she isn't following the rules. Greta drops the phone, but then there's knocking on the door, and something is left in front of it. Your favorite, says the voice. Greta opens the door to find a tray with a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and Brahms still sitting on his bed with the rules. Greta approaches the doll and finally understands that Brahms just wants her to follow the rules. Malcolm calls and tries to invite her out, but Greta hangs up, as her attention is now all on the doll. Elsewhere far away, the Heelshires are writing a farewell letter to Brahms before filling their pockets with stones and walking into the ocean. The next day, Greta begins to follow the rules to the letter, except for the goodnight kiss. Many days later, Malcolm visits her because she didn't answer the phone. He also brings the mail, which she ignores. After promising she's okay, he tries to invite her out again, she rejects him, and he leaves. Along with the doll, Greta tries to make it pick up a fruit, asking for a sign of a spirit's presence in the house. At first, there's no response, but when Greta leaves the kitchen, she hears a noise, and upon returning sees that Brahms has moved on its own. Hours later, Malcolm returns to the house because Greta called him. She needs someone else to see this. After many tests, she found out that Brahms only moves if no one can see him. To prove it, she draws on the floor around him with chalk, and then leaves the room with Malcolm. When they check on him after a few minutes, nothing happened. But Greta wants to try again, so she asks Brahms very kindly to help her. This time, when they leave and return, the doll is no longer standing in the chalk outline. Malcolm finally believes her. They talk about it afterward. Greta tells him she thinks this is happening for a reason. Her ex was abusive and made her lose the pregnancy. Malcolm now understands why this is so important to her, and they kiss. Later that night, after putting Brahms to bed, Greta returns to her room, where she and Malcolm start to kiss. Someone watches them through the keyhole, and the sudden noise of music interrupts them. They go downstairs to find the record player playing and Brahms sitting nearby. Greta takes the doll back to bed before going to the kitchen to make some coffee while Malcolm tells her it would be prudent for her to spend the night in town. She refuses, so Malcolm tells her another story. Years ago, a girl named Emily Cribbs used to come play with Brahms. Greta refuses to leave even after hearing that the girl's body was found not far from the house on the same day it caught fire, and they never found the killer. She checks on Brahms in his room and, for the first time, gives him a goodnight kiss before going to the attic. There, she looks at the photo album again, finding pictures of Emily and noticing her angry face while Brahms stared at her seriously. The next day, after returning home from checking the traps, she hears the sound of the pool table. She goes there with Brahms and finds out Cole broke in. They have dinner together, and Cole tries to convince her that he's changed so she'll come back to him. Malcolm then shows up, and after awkward introductions, he uses the groceries as an excuse to talk to Greta privately. He says he's worried Cole might hurt her, but Greta says she has a plan. Malcolm leaves the house but not the area, deciding to stay in the car just as a precaution. Inside, Greta brings sheets and pillows for Cole to sleep on the couch. Cole tries to convince her to leave again and goes for a kiss, which she dodges before leaving. She takes Brahms to the room and says she needs help. Later that night, we see drops of blood falling on Cole's face, and he wakes up to find rat corpses in his bag, a message in red on the wall that says "Get out," and the doll sitting nearby. Greta rushes to him when she hears him scream her name, and when she gets there, he accuses her of being responsible for all this. Greta grabs Brahms, and a furious Cole starts chasing her. Malcolm hears the screams and enters to find Cole taking the doll from Greta. He starts shaking the doll while shouting, and tired of hearing Greta and Malcolm asking him to be careful with Brahms, he smashes the doll against a chair. Something starts making noise in the walls, and Cole approaches the mirror to try to get a better look. The mirror suddenly shatters toward him, throwing him back and revealing who was making the noises, an adult man wearing a porcelain mask. The real Brahms, calling for Greta with the same childlike voice she heard on the phone before. Brahms jumps on Cole, and after some struggle, he manages to kill him. He then grabs Greta, but Malcolm appears from behind and hits him before taking Greta away. Brahms starts chasing them around the house. Greta and Malcolm try to lock themselves in their room, but Brahms knows the secret passages in the walls, so he has no trouble reaching them anywhere. After running for a while, they finally have a chance to escape when they find the door to one of Brahms' secret passages, which they enter. Greta and Malcolm find a hidden room, the place where Brahms has been living all this time. He has everything he needs and more. Greta finds her dress and hair on a doll that Brahms made to imitate her. She also finds the letter from her parents saying they're not coming back and that he could have the girl. They go back to the secret passages, and Malcolm finally catches up to them. After another chase, he jumps on Malcolm and knocks him out while Greta finds a way out and escapes from the house. She reaches the gates and stops there, realizing she can't leave yet. She needs to go back for Malcolm. Back at the house, she grabs a screwdriver she hides in her pocket before meeting Brahms. She tells him she came back for him, then uses her authoritative nanny voice to order him back to bed. After some hesitation, he obeys. Greta takes him to bed and puts him down, and when she tries to leave, Brahms asks for the goodnight kiss. She refuses, saying that's his punishment for misbehaving. But Brahms grabs her arm and insists, so Greta has no choice but to lean in for a kiss. When Brahms puts his porcelain mouth against her real lips, she takes the chance to grab the screwdriver and use it on him. Brahms pushes her away, and after getting out of bed, he grabs her by the neck and presses her against the wall, intending to suffocate her. For a moment, Greta seems out of it, but at the last second, she recovers and pushes the screwdriver deeper until he faints. The mask breaks, and we see Brahms' face is burned underneath it. Greta hurriedly leaves the room to find Malcolm and take him to the car so they can escape from the house. She smiles when she realizes they're finally free. The movie ends with a pair of hands wearing sleeves very similar to Brahms putting the doll back together.